So UNESCO and its World Heritage Program form the centerpiece, as Meskell just mentioned, of my talk tonight, because together they represent the aspirations of the international community, the limitations of world government, concerns for protection and rights, and notions of the global good. At the very heart of this mission has always been archaeological and cultural heritage, and to a lesser degree, natural heritage. UNESCO is one of the most powerful arenas where archaeology reaches the world. It gets worldwide attention, and yet archaeologists themselves, I would argue, seem largely invisible in the political processes, governance, and public profile of the organization. That seeming invisibility, however, masks a substantial archaeological network, and Himanshu spoke about that 2 nights ago here with some detail. It's a network of field projects and practitioners around the globe, consultants, site evaluators, conservators, training projects, university courses and conferences, as we heard about, and none of that is neutral in any way. Now, India has long held an important place in the World Heritage System, and some of you in the audience may have been involved in UNESCO activities and perhaps have observed some of the developments that I go on to describe. So I'm very grateful to be given this opportunity and also would welcome your insights. Now, I've always had an interest in the politics of archaeology globally. As was mentioned earlier, I've worked in the Middle East for a long time, but I'm also trained in Australia where politics are high on the agenda. But this specific research began in 2010 during meetings at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. And since 2011, I've been granted official observer status at World Heritage Committee sessions each year. Now, this is something you can't petition to do as an individual. You have to go through your institution. From a qualitative perspective, I've conducted interviews with the UNESCO Secretariat, officials from all 3 advisory bodies, ambassadors, including the Indian ambassadors, members of national delegations, archaeologists, and conservators that are involved in site nominations, as well as independent evaluators, consultants, and academics. This work has taken me to Myanmar, Peru, Turkey, France, and Cambodia to follow UNESCO's mission in country. And as an archaeologist, as you saw yesterday, I've also done field work at World Heritage sites in Egypt, South Africa, and Turkey. On the more quantitative side, I have an ongoing collaboration with cultural economists using econometric analysis to trace the international political pacting, economic interests, and voting patterns that today shape the World Heritage agenda. Now, I think both modes of analysis, the quantitative and the qualitative, are necessary. And I think being trained as an archaeologist provides a unique vantage that I think is different from other scholars working on UNESCO. Archaeologists are interested in the long term, as you heard last night, in patterns of change, issues of scale, and we tend to work at multiple field sites. This is not unusual for us, and we return to do so over many years. In this instance, we're also deeply embedded in the knowledge and practices surrounding archaeological and cultural sites. So we know about their histories, their multiple and contemporary uses, their interpretations, politics, and conservation. So you may be aware that there's a vast outpouring now of work on UNESCO in the last 5 to 10 years, particularly the 1972 Convention and World Heritage from various disciplines, as I've mentioned, economics, law, policy, tourism studies, international relations, and anthropology. Much has been written about UNESCO, especially in my field, in archaeology and heritage studies, that I suggest really fails to capture the complexity or even the structure of the organization. And this is something that Himanshu also pointed to as well. And it also fails to capture the shifting power brokers on the World Heritage stage. Many researchers rely solely on the documents or online sources, and the result of that is that substantive political issues are often masked as technical ones. So, as you can see in this wonderful and very typical snapshot from a document being drafted at a World Heritage Committee meeting, here just one decision is being taken, and you can see the number of countries intervening that have differing positions, amendments, deletions, and so on. It's also being done simultaneously in French on another vast screen, with all the problems and arguments over proper translation going on. You can read Annalise Riles or Matthew Hull for further discussion of this kind of bureaucracy. You can see the countries that align here and those that diverge repeatedly on one very important issue, conflict of interest. And this is also something we've talked about in the last couple of days. This is entirely the work of individual national representatives rather than bureaucrats from UNESCO Paris headquarters. So one has to consider the relationships and hierarchies amongst those who produce the text and the difference between fully capturing those discussions in the room as an observer and then later what gets formalized into the record for posterity. As archaeologists, we need to understand how organizations like UNESCO have global impacts, albeit often in unexpected and unpredictable ways that are not always revealed, obviously, in official agendas. I suggest that archaeologists need to study up since the fate of our sites and the people around them, more importantly, is being decided. So in a sense, being there to witness this is essential to track the global machinations playing out today in this new order of things. One common mistake is that archaeologists typically presume that power largely resides with UNESCO's Paris headquarters, and they critique the organization in the most general of terms. As an intergovernmental agency and part of the UN family, it's the states parties or nation states that are signatories to the convention that are the most powerful decision makers in World Heritage. Now, since the United States, you may be aware of this, has withdrawn its financial support from UNESCO after Palestine's admission as a member, the World Heritage Center has also been crippled, facing the worst financial and staffing crisis of its history. So one country has done lasting damage to UNESCO, although this is not the first time it's been done. The US has withdrawn support several times before. It is proving the most dramatic. About 22 people are now employed full-time in Paris. Many have been sent to regional offices, and so only the shell of the organization remains. When I started work just a few years ago, there were 70 people or more. So, and even that, I was told, was a reduction from previous years. So the World Heritage Center, instead of being independent as an entity, is now essentially managed from the culture sector, with senior staff now overseeing numerous, like 6 international conventions, rather than focusing their efforts solely on World Heritage. And it's also this weakness and financial deficit that I think is also allowing other countries to come in. And we saw this with discussions of the Maritime Silk Route and Project MOSAM. It's also that those particularly powerful and well-heeled countries are using their influence also in that secretariat to get what they want. So maybe that's something we can talk about in question time. So the states parties are the most powerful players, if you like, particularly those 21 countries that have representation on the World Heritage Committee. Securing a seat on the committee is seen by many nations as one way to effectively raise their profile right across the UN system. Today, state-appointed ambassadors and politicians, rather than cultural or natural experts, dominate these national delegations. The committee is the actual body responsible for the implementation of the 1972 Convention. It has the final say on whether a property is inscribed on the list. It also examines reports on the state of conservation of properties and asks states parties to take action if deemed necessary. It also makes decisions about inclusion or deletion of properties from the World Heritage List in danger. So it is immensely powerful, this committee. Given UNESCO's ethos of recognition and reconciliation, cultural diversity, the protection of minority lifeways, it's not surprising that this convention has emerged as the only structural avenue to the global governance and promotion of the world's heritage. And the desire for recognition and inscription, as we see when we think of Ahmedabad just down the road, has only increased over time. And it continues to go on, and so now almost all nations of the world want some of their sites at least included on this list. So now I think we must be up to 36 by now, right? So this was earlier, before the meetings that we just had in Poland. So we have to ask why the stakes have become so high for so many countries. Why should India, the US, Russia, China, or even the newly emerging Myanmar for that matter, really care about World Heritage listing. The notion that World Heritage sites are commodities that mobilize national and international flows should not be surprising to any of us in the room. As archaeologists, we've seen that UNESCO site recognition accrues direct tourist revenues and other economic benefits for the site, and therefore the state party. The annual World Heritage Committee sessions take place for 10 days each year. They're days filled with meetings, side meetings, events, receptions, as well as endless diplomacy, perhaps not so much diplomacy in some cases, lobbying and political negotiation. During the last few years, state agendas have come to eclipse the substantive discussions of the merits of site nominations in tandem with issues raised over community benefits and the participation of Indigenous stakeholders. So what we're starting to see is that lobbying is taking over from even discussing conservation issues like mining, exploitation, or infrastructural development. And these really are the main issues that are affecting World Heritage and heritage sites everywhere. I probably don't need to say that here in India. Indeed, several prominent ambassadors on the committee explained that the real focus is solely getting sites inscribed. So 3 days out of the 10 are paramount. So it's about inscription, not conservation. So the ancillary effects of listing in what I would call the supplements to heritage, according to these diplomats, outweigh the outmoded Eurocentric notions of universal value, authenticity, and integrity. Excuse me. So another notable trend is that this collective decision-making and the overarching responsibility for the conservation of sites, once that was the remit of national delegates with training in cultural and natural expertise, has been replaced by this: excessive backstage lobbying by politicians and the bargaining power of nations with geopolitical alliances based on geography, religion, trade partnerships, or even just anti-Western sentiment. So the ideal that we used to have about the collective responsibility, both fiscal and ethical, that was once so central to the convention is losing ground. State parties petition aggressively for support before and during the meetings, and international alliances are cemented prior to properties being presented there's no debate, but at least presented to the committee. To track these political developments, I wanted to see if any trends emerge from the last decade of UNESCO committee sessions, specifically the nominations of properties for inscription on that World Heritage list. To do this, I think it's important to both use qualitative and quantitative approaches to analyze the patterns in decision-making during those critical World Heritage sessions. And just to remind you, there are only 4 decisions that can be taken for any site that's nominated. So in a sense, Ahmedabad could have had any one of these 4 decisions: to inscribe, to refer, to defer, and to not inscribe. So in terms of my qualitative data, I draw from observations from committee sessions and interviews with senior UNESCO officials and representatives from different countries. On the quantitative side, I'm working with cultural economists, as I said. We've collected data from records, both from my work as an observer, but also from UNESCO's own historic documents for the last decade or more. For each nomination, we track various kinds of data. We noted what the advisory bodies that Himanshu mentioned yesterday, ICOMOS and UNESCO, what their initial recommendation was, and then the final decision that's adopted by the World Heritage Committee. We also record the number of delegates sent by any country, and that's really important for lobbying. And so I want you to have a look at some Asian nations, the number of delegates that they send by country. How many years a nation has served on the committee, how many times they intervene. So every time they speak, we track that. And what position they take. Do they support a decision or do they challenge it? And this sort of unfuzzy data, this is the sort of opposite. Somebody asked me this about archaeological data. How can you ever know? Well, this is very different. This is very unfuzzy data, and it's very effective for things like network analysis. So this methodology provides detailed information on the procedural aspects of that decision-making process. Remember that in UNESCO, unless something is very, very contentious, it doesn't go to a vote. It's all done by consensus building. So people are trying to have dialogue and talk other countries around, right? So it's not like a secret ballot or anything like that, unless it is highly, highly contentious and consensus can't be achieved. So I'm really looking at how the expert recommendations and state party actions in the World Heritage Committee relate to each other in the final selection of sites. In other analyses, it can be shown how high profile certain countries are, how influential and how well resourced they are. And I think these types of techniques can provide an effective statistical measure of the tensions that we see emerging in the World Heritage arena. This is now all published, and if you want to read our findings, they're all available through my academia website. If we look at this table, we can see the polarity of positions by comparing the advisory body recommendations that we see on the left and the final World Heritage Committee decisions in 314 cases over the last decade. Here it's worth noting that in only 7 cases, the final committee decision is more negative or lower, more critical than the advisory bodies. And then when we examine recent decision-making from 2008 to 2013, a smaller window, it's clear that the final decisions taken by the World Heritage Committee have been more divergent for nominations recommended by the advisory bodies for referral, to send them back for more work, that they're not ready to be inscribed. So focus on that one left-hand column with the very high percentages, 97%, 91%, and so on. These are sites that should have been deferred or referred, but were now pushed and slated for inscription. So sites that maybe don't have their conservation ready, that don't have their buffer zone, that don't have management plans, that are going to come back in a year's time with real issues and challenges that then someone has to pay for again. In 2014, 47% of ICOMOS and IUCN's recommendations were overturned by the committee, so almost half. And then a record 81% of all nominated sites that year were inscribed on the list, taking the total up over 1,000, which people said would never happen, but of course did. So I hope to have demonstrated clearly that the overall trend in recent years has been to push all the final decisions toward the category of inscription. So from referral to inscription, deferral to referral, or jumping 2 categories to inscription, and so on. In almost every case, there's a complete agreement between the advisory bodies and the committee when, of course, the initial recommendation is to inscribe a property. Nobody says, we don't agree with you then. If you say inscribe to begin with, they say, what a fantastic job these advisory bodies have done. So in this graph, if we look at all of those expert recommendations instead that are to defer, refer, and not inscribe, we observe this dramatic decline over the past decade. We can see a real level of divergence and disagreement between what the World Heritage Committee thinks and what ICOMOS and the IUCN argue. So I want to show you now this network analysis that maps the relationships between countries nominating sites to the list and the responses offered by members of the committee. And this is again over the last decade. In this chart, we're specifically looking at the instances where the advisory bodies have decided to defer a dossier in the last decade. The red circles represent countries nominating their own properties. And here you can see India, France, the Philippines, and Bahrain. They all have very large circles or nodes, meaning they have many ties, or many other nations have intervened, have spoken up about their nominations during discussion. The blue squares represent the members of the committee who have also intervened. And in this particular analysis, these are the countries that have agreed, the very few countries that have agreed with the advisory bodies and their evaluations. And they do not want to support inscription for these properties at this time. So in that year, they're saying send it back and do some more work. So you might say that these are the rule-following countries. They are sometimes also called the neutral countries, and you can see, unsurprisingly, Switzerland, Sweden, Estonia, and sometimes Australia and the UK. But the Nordic countries are very much the rule followers at UNESCO, and they privilege ideas of conservation. When these countries serve on the committee, they adhere to the rules of procedure. They do not put forward their own sites during their mandate, and they only serve on the committee for 4 years. The Scandinavians all follow a self-imposed regional rule. They are extremely well behaved. They only allow one Scandinavian country at any one time to serve on the committee. Now, if Europe did that, that would be amazing, but of course it doesn't. The Swiss are also very good. They tend to fund internal reports on the organization. They coordinate meetings. They fund conservation, and so on. But as you can see, these nations are very, very few as opposed to all the others. It's another reminder that most signatories to the 1972 convention seeking site inscription are not happy with the work of ICOMOS and the IUCN. They're also very critical of the World Heritage Center. And one Indian ambassador made it his mission in, I guess, over 3 out of 4 years to be extremely critical of the bureaucrats who sat in Paris. Indeed, the whole notion of expertise, who has it, where it can be secured from, is now being fiercely debated. And we talked about this on site in Ahmedabad only this morning, where one of the key people who was involved in formulating the dossier and managing the site was saying, we have indigenous expertise in this country. We don't need to always have somebody from the UK or France come out and tell us how Indian cities should be. And so this is becoming a more current and popular sentiment, and it's very valid. You could also say that World Heritage status and recognition is today much more than preservation, or that inscription can be conferred before conservation management plans are finalized. Indeed, listing, instead of doing a good conservation plan and then getting listing, it's almost the reverse. If you list the site, you might argue that you could be enabled and facilitated to then get your management plan finalized. So in fact, it's almost, as I said, been reversed. And this is the case with emerging nations that say, unless we have the inscription up front, we're not going to get the funding to do this work. We're not going to get the preservation unless we have a helping hand. Sorry. So World Heritage listing has different meanings for different nations, and one could argue that a broad suite of benefits attached to sites represents the most tangible and beneficial expressions of UNESCO's original intent for the convention. Most nations desperately want World Heritage status, perhaps more than ever before. And after these findings and from my own observations and statistics, I wanted to see why there was so much dissatisfaction with the World Heritage process to date. Perhaps more importantly, it's not difficult to uncover the regional bias within the World Heritage framework. Now, when I was doing this work, I was looking at up to 2014. There were over 1,000 sites at that point. This is a trend that has continued. Almost half, 48%, are still from Europe and North America. A figure that is more than twice the next highest region, which is Asia and the Pacific, which has 23% of the sites. Even lower are those regions of Latin America and the Caribbean with 13%, and Africa with 9%, the Arab states with 8%. This inequality of distribution with Europe and North America, as you can see by this red line, just continuing, and that continues to continue as we've gone along. It goes back to the very beginnings of the World Heritage List. So it was always Eurocentric from the beginning, from the late 1970s when the first sites were inscribed. But what is sad about this, I guess, and striking, is that in 1994, a global strategy, a huge program was implemented by UNESCO, and another one more recently called the upstreaming process, to address these structural imbalances, to change the regional listings and change these profiles. None of this has worked. So a huge amount of bureaucratic effort, financial effort, a lot of feel-good sentiment, and nothing has changed. It is, in fact, I think, more divergent. So you can imagine that the countries like India, have been vocal critics of this regional imbalance that continues to favor the listing of European properties. And this dissatisfaction is mirrored in an outpouring of scholarly criticism too about the Eurocentrism that plagues the World Heritage Convention. However, there is some evidence that things could change, especially as a result of the Cairns decision that prohibits nations from putting forward more than 2 sites a year, and we're now going to transition into trying for 1 site only a year. If we look at patterns of inscription from 2001 onwards and correcting for the size of each region, the gap between Asia and the Pacific and Europe and North America closes somewhat, with both regions exhibiting the same level of inscription activity. And this is largely due to countries like China and Japan, quite frankly. So when we say Asia and the Pacific, there are also sub-regions, right? This is not Bangladesh and Myanmar, rushing to get millions of sites on. This is largely northern Asian countries like China and Japan, Korea to some degree. So the trend, I would suggest, is paralleled in regional participation itself at these meetings and within the committee. So all states parties to the convention, regardless of whether they have a mandate to the World Heritage Committee or not, are permitted to send a delegation to those annual meetings. And the last ones we just had were in Poland. Delegations that are not committee members are called, like I am, an observer, but they maintain indirect involvement in the decision-making process. They can still lobby, obviously. It doesn't mean that they're unimportant. Their presence is very crucial, again, India's participation this year, they weren't on the committee, but they had to send somebody because Ahmedabad was not slated for inscription, so they had to mobilize to have support and explain to committee members why this site should be included on the list. So being able to afford to send somebody is very important. And if you're Burkina Faso or Eritrea or Angola, or Yemen, more importantly nowadays, you will not be able to afford to do that. So let me just, this is delegation size. This is just one meeting. So you can see here, this is for the 38th session. This is the session that Himanshu mentioned that she presented Project Mossam in Doha in Qatar in 2014. On one end, there are many nations that cannot afford to send a single person. Yemen this year was a good example. There are other countries that have very, very large diplomatic teams, more than 30 people or so on. So this is an enormous amount of lobbying. So yes, you can see the disparity. I think the largest number we ever saw was 50 or 70 people were sent by China in just 1 year. And this costs thousands of dollars. You're there for 10 days in a very expensive hotel. Nobody stays in a B&B or a hostel. These are all 5-star hotels, 5-star conference centers, international flights, a lot of hosting. People do side events that have catering. This is millions of dollars. So yes, so China, the example I just mentioned, 91 individuals were sent in 1 year, 2012. So in the context of the UN, the size of diplomatic missions, together with the presence of experienced diplomats, is necessary for attaining status in larger political negotiations. In my analysis, I use delegation size as a proxy for the interest and investment in the World Heritage process, since sending a larger delegation, as I said, is expensive and complex to coordinate. So in this graph, national delegations were tallied together with their regional group for each year from 1998 to 2014 in order to facilitate comparisons in World Heritage participation at the regional level. For each regional group, there is a rise in delegation size over time. So we know that getting UNESCO listing becomes more and more important. The general increase may reflect changing practices of politicization, which means that larger delegations are needed for more complex negotiations. And we could talk about this in recent tensions between China, Korea, and Japan, for example, and larger media coverage and so on. So this is this increase at the organizational level is underpinned by dynamics at the regional level, as I just suggested with those three countries. The most striking change is the rise of Asia and the Pacific as a region, first coming to prominence in the early 2000s and then dominance even by the late 2000s. It now surpasses the participation of Europe and North America. It might not have all the sites there yet, but it's having more and more people attend those meetings. In 4 out of the last 8 sessions of the World Heritage Committee, Asia and the Pacific has supported the largest regional delegation, the other 4 seeing a majority from Europe and North America. So to summarize, regional categories lie at the heart of debates over global representation and equity in the World Heritage Committee. The Europe and North America region has historically been the most dominant region, and as I've shown here, continues to be in terms of listing, despite 25 years of the global strategy, which has been operative, as I said, with very, very limited success. In the last decade, Asia and the Pacific has a growing presence in many areas of World Heritage, and this is the region to watch, and this is why it's important for India to be engaged. And as we saw, it's not that regions stick together and support each other necessarily, even if they have serial or transnational nominations. There can be enormous amounts of politicking and appropriation of heritage, as Himanshu mentioned, with Maritime Silk Routes and Project Mosam. These are great examples of exactly what is at stake. And it's not just World Heritage and a few monuments and some nice communities and whatever else that we should be looking at that's at stake, but it's also military and political and economic issues. And all of those have to be studied together. So the 72 Convention, which is fully called Concerning the Protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage, is considered now to be a near universal instrument for the protection of global patrimony. Inscription on the list is increasingly regarded as a valuable driver for development. I'm sure that was said at Ahmedabad as well. It's a driver for sustainable development. It's about peace and intercultural dialogue. Of course, this overlooks the fact that many World Heritage properties have been embroiled in conflicts, as we know all too well, from Syria, Iraq, Mali, Yemen, Cambodia, and so on. The convention is facing serious challenges on a number of fronts, from its funding, as I mentioned, to its credibility in the sense of being a global instrument, not just a European one. But it remains one of the most powerful mechanisms for countries and communities to showcase their particular historical achievements to the wider world. These threats, in conjunction with mounting pressure on the World Heritage Centre from some members of the committee, comes at the very time when those same nations are pushing more and more vigorously for their own sites to be listed. This escalating desire for recognition and inscription has, over the past decade, shaped the World Heritage agenda, and what I suggest is it's cast UNESCO as an agency for global branding and recognition rather than conservation. World Heritage sites, their nomination, inscription, monitoring and conservation further leverages and consolidates international relationships, strategic partnerships, and worldviews. Today, heritage is less important for what it is than for what it can do. So none of this, I think, exists outside the frame of global politics, as I mentioned, writ large, and as archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists, and so on. I think this is one of the greatest and most daunting stages upon which our work reaches the world. Since the end of the Second World War, the international community has sought to establish and maintain institutions that govern its common affairs. And the arena of World Heritage is no different. This is the sort of cultural diplomacy we talked about 2 nights ago. While such institutions can take many forms, by far the most important have been formal international agreements through which countries bind themselves together under international law to negotiated commitments. The competing political and economic interests that we see today over issues as broad as climate change or nuclear proliferation are no different to those of the 72 Convention on World Heritage. And one of my informants told me that he had worked in the Human Rights Commission for a long time. And he said that was nothing in terms of the politics and fraught nature that he encountered when he did cultural heritage. So that will give you an idea of how the stakes have changed. Over the past 40 years, UNESCO, cultural heritage, and this idea of promoting the past has been part of an elusive hope for a better world. Yet the World Heritage Convention is not so much about protection anymore, but also development, branding, and promoting new types of nominations within a new heritage economy. While many observers might be critical of the changes that are occurring, we need to understand the reasons why so many countries are dissatisfied and why they're choosing other ways of getting what they want. Europe and North America continue to dominate the World Heritage arena, as I said, and that notwithstanding the many efforts that UNESCO has gone to, such as the global strategy and upstreaming process. Yet how can World Heritage be understood as constituting global patrimony that purports to show outstanding universal value when participation and power continue to be so imbalanced? Participation is also clearly connected to the possibilities of involvement and influence in the committee itself, being successfully elected as a new member and the necessary lobbying to support that. And there was a terrible case several years ago, 2 years ago, I think, when no African nation was voted onto the committee. So, I mean, how can you, and Africa is actually one of UNESCO's global priorities with gender for the next 10 years. And an entire continent has been left out. I mean, it's quite shocking. And so I would suggest, if you're interested in any of those issues, to actually look at the statistics. So today, World Heritage recognition and status symbolizes far more than site protection. Indeed, conservation and management issues are wide-ranging, and we need to think about other concerns, not just branding, but things like good governance, tourism and development, partnerships, and so on. A new suite of states, particularly Asian nations, as I mentioned, now comprise approximately 1/3 of the World Heritage Committee. And I think at the time when I drafted that is the case. That is now shifting somewhat, but it was a moment, and it could be still a moment again, where we could challenge the prevailing Western notions of monuments and their management and the understandings of World Heritage. And I think, we had a very good example of how we could blend cultural and natural heritage, as I mentioned in Himanshu's talk, how we could involve local communities, how you could do a transnational dossier differently. So it's really only when you have those nations involved and as collaborators that you can break the fascination. Why do we need any more cathedrals, schlosses, palaces, gardens? Really, most of Europe is now inscribed on the list. Now we need something different and something that breaks that mold, and that I think is truly transnational and cross-disciplinary. And we need that to serve expansive contemporary and more inclusive global goals. So being attendant to regionalism, how that's constructed by international agencies and how it's being performed today is key to understanding these current developments that I've outlined in the World Heritage Agenda. So thank you very much.